Now I would like to open a discussion. So everybody that wants to ask a question can write in the chat box. So first, I will have here already a couple of questions. And I have first a question for Ron from Miriam, who is asking, what is your opinion on the research done via activism? For example, helping migrants to illegally cross the borders on the Balkan route.
Yeah, this is a very good question, and obviously it crops up quite a lot now in terms of migration, immigration problems. But it also operates in a range of different areas, and one of the biggest fields is participant action research. Now, I think the issue here really has to do with, and again, I fall back on my view about the virtuous researcher. The only way in which we operate is in terms of examining our own sets of values and cultures and linking that to what might be the context within which those have to be seen to apply. So it is a question about boundaries and how you manage the boundary. And so it has to do with this difference between, if you like, morality and the law. So a researcher who is operating in this field has to make a decision. It might not be, sort of black-white decision about, obeying the law or not obeying the law. It might be degrees of disobedience to the law. But there's no doubt that, of course, anybody who is doing that is, for want of a better term, an action researcher, has declared their particular set of values, which are clearly political and necessarily contravene the law. Of course, what we know is that the law isn't always moral. So a researcher has to make a decision about whether they disobey an immoral law or a less than moral law, or whether or not they just routinely follow the law and regard that as the moral stance that they take. It isn't an easy question. It is just that the researcher has to make their mind up about whether they are willing to, if you like, cross that boundary in terms of activism, in terms of action. Personally, I admire them, but I don't know whether I could do it. And that's what one always needs to say in contexts like this. Years ago, it used to be a question about, let me give you an example. I had a supervisor in my first degree in university who was studying the use of illegal drugs. And he argued that in order to study the use of illegal drugs, he would have to take them himself. Now, isn't that stretching it a little bit? But it's an action research, there's no doubt about that. And the decision has to be justifiable and justified to the researcher themselves in a situation like that.
There is a sub-question now from Miriam. Should this be clear in the article you are writing? So in the dissemination phase, how to deal with it? I mean, the ethical decision-making, should it be clear in the article?
Yes, and of course it should always be clear when you write about it. I mean, increasingly these days, academic journals are asking people, more often than not, did you get ethics approval for this particular study? But that isn't the only question that one needs to answer in an article. One needs to address. You might have got ethics approval because you didn't tell the ethics committee all of what you were going to do, right? And certain things cropped up while you were out there. You might not have intended to behave illegally, but when you found yourself in a situation where you needed to help a migrant, you found yourself doing something illegal, then in that case, I think it's ethically sound to report it. However, here's an issue, and that is if that in some way led to harm to the migrants, it might be best not to report it. And I would consider that to be ethical too. It is a very complex area, this overlay between, ethics and the law.
Thank you, Ron. There's another question for you from Mimi. Mimi, would you like to ask yourself, or should I read it?
You may read it. You may read it.
Okay, so there is a widely spread thinking in the research community that following all ethical aspects, especially GDPR regulation, hinders research work. So can you give us an example where following ethical aspects can function in favor of research work to make research easier, better, and so on? Are you able to provide arguments why to follow ethical standards, arguments that go beyond pure pure sense of what is morally right?
Yeah, this is an interesting field too, isn't it? The GDPR has certainly created a lot of problems in ethical terms, but then data protection has always been problematic, even before the legal regulations became, let's say, more global or more universal. I mean, remember, it took many years to get this GDPR regulation, from a directive to a regulation. And that is because there were an awful lot of objections to what it meant for research. I mean, amongst other things, and what it meant for notions of privacy and what was made publicly available. So the first answer to Mimi's question is, yeah, it is obstructive. It does get in the way and it does hinder research work. It isn't helped by the fact that some elements of it still need interpretation. And particularly, if you look at what it says on historical research, it's not clear. I've been in a panel review where we spent almost a day just discussing the interpretation of a particular piece of historical research, and it had to do with what GDPR claimed, you could do and not do. So yes, I mean, I would say data protection generally gets in the way of research. And I and others, and I can say that even the ethics unit within the European Commission, have been trying for some time to separate issues of data protection from ethical judgment and ethical appraisal and ethics appraisal. And I think what we need to be doing is saying, well, if there is a law, this is the law on data protection, right? And it has nothing to do with ethics then. Have you got a data protection officer in your organization? Have you got a data management plan? All of those are the things, and they're straightforward. They're administrative, if you like, and regulatory. Keep that separate from concerns about ethics. But then, of course, the interesting thing, and this is the final bit of Mimi's question, you would then have to go back, if you decided to contravene some aspect of data protection, you would need a very good ethical justification for doing it. You might still get prosecuted, right? But again, as with all action research, you have a decision to take about how far you go. I have two examples then, perhaps. One that has been very common for some time, and that is you might get, let's say, informed consent to interview a child. The child's assent and the parent's consent or the guardian's consent. And then while you're interviewing the child reveals something that the parent would not have liked the child to reveal, usually in the field of abuse of some kind, either sexual or physical abuse. What do you do about that? Well, you have to make a decision. Which is the greatest harm? To actually disclose it, report it to the authorities, or to deal with it in a different way? Now, I have had this crop up with my PhD students, with the research projects I've been involved with, on many, many occasions, and I can't say that we solved it in one way. Sometimes I insisted that the researcher reported it to the authorities. On other occasions, I said it is best not to say anything about this. Usually if it was historic child abuse. You're interviewing somebody who's 25, let's say, or 30, and they talk about, a father who is now ill, who abused them when they were younger. And, okay, it's an ethical judgment. It's also, obviously, in UK law, you have to report it. So it should have been reported. And it is the case in other European countries where it should have been reported, but not all. So, it seems to me that that's actually a good example, but it also raises this notion that the actual researcher themselves has to take on that responsibility and take that decision and live with the consequences. I mean, I do have another example, which is linked to the clinical work I used to do. I used to do training for healthcare professionals in clinical hypnosis. And we had, obviously, when you're doing that, you do a demonstration. One of the members of the audience, who was a health professional, agreed to go through the hypnosis session. And something emerged during that session that that person would not have disclosed in another situation. It was in front of 300 people. She had actually agreed to the session. My researcher turned around and looked at me and said, "Should I go on?" I said yes. Now, afterwards, we did a debriefing with the person concerned. They were extremely grateful that we carried on. No legal situation followed. However, 300 people were suddenly disclosed to something that was very, very personal and very private to the person. Okay, I don't know, did I make the right decision? My only justification is that the person themselves said, "I am glad that you did carry on." It's, you know, I've got loads and loads of examples. We don't have the time for them here, but it illustrates the issue. And fundamentally, back to my point, the burden is on the individual researcher.
Thank you. And there's one more question for you, and then we also move on to other questions for other speakers. And this question relates to the last point you made. So Daria Mazi-Leskova is asking, could you expand on the relationship between the goodness of a person and the ethical behavior of a researcher?
Yes. I happen to think that only good people can do good research, right? I happen to think that only good people can do morally good research, and I actually happen to think that only good people will do methodologically sound research as well. I mean, this is, in a sense, linked to Debora's points about plagiarism, is it not? You know, because what you've got there are people who may or may not be good people who are doing not good things, and they know. I know the problem of intent and intentionality is there, but when you see such blocks of plagiarism going on, you know that somebody knows what they've done, you know, to that extent, and particularly when they start to amend it just a little bit, so, you know, detection software is less likely to actually work. They know exactly what they're doing. You know, it is a very, very difficult area. I tried to address this in, I think, the first book that I fully wrote on this, which was about ethical decision-making in social research. I actually wrote in the first chapter what I've just said to you, that I think only good people can do good research. However, you know, bad people can do good research too. And that is the fundamental dilemma. And I think it's one of the reasons I raised that issue about eugenicists. I mean, I think Fisher, you know, produced a really good statistical test. It's just unfortunate that he was a eugenicist, which is fundamentally, to me, unethical. But, you know, so I advise people to read the first chapter of my book on that, where I'm trying to make the argument. I might say that one of my good colleagues said I shouldn't make that argument, and when he was reviewing the book. However, I think it really is important because it is linked to the notion of virtue ethics. It's linked to the notion of character being linked to a good researcher.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. There's one question for Ildiko, and it's related to the Science with and for Society program that was there in Horizon 2020 and in different forms also in previous framework programs. So what will happen with this in the Horizon Europe? What are your thoughts on that, Ildiko?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you very much for the possibility. Yes, in fact, unfortunately, the Science with and for Society program will not be continued in Horizon Europe. This is really indeed a pity, because we have entered the period when we could actually start seeing the medium long-term results of the initial activities. At the same time, in Horizon Europe, some of the pillars of RRI have been integrated as overarching horizontal features. For example, citizen science, gender and ethics issues. So we will see a little bit of involvement in this sense. But I hope that it has made its impact and it has made some publicity so far. And in this last call set of the Science with and for Society program, the Commission has put quite some funds on initiatives that are called to assemble the experiences and the know-how collected so far within this funding approach. So whoever is interested and would be interested and in fact make similar actions at institutional level will have lots of valuable resources to reach out to. So this is a good part of the news that is actually bad news, because I think this is a feature that should have been continued throughout the research program, because the focus is that scientific developments and innovation actions should take into consideration citizen needs and should be responsible to the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ildiko. We now move to questions for Debora. There have been 3 questions already regarding auto-plagiarism. So how to deal with reusing your previous work?
This is a hot topic,
Yeah.
Especially in biomedical research, but also in other areas. I have a very clear position on this, and it's don't copy your text from one to another. Whether you're just recycling a section that says, this is how I did this, or whether you're doing a complete duplicate publication, you're stealing the time from other researchers, because the point of publication is to communicate. We want to communicate with other people, and there's so much out there that's published today. People would waste time reading a paper that they've already read before in another situation. And of course, it also creates a situation where it looks like you have 3 papers when actually you only did 1. And I know many tenure boards and stuff like that, they only count. They look at the quantitative information and don't look at the qualitative aspect of this. Now, the panic comes up, yes, but this is what I do my research on. Can't I just reuse it, or can I reword it? Don't reword it, quote it. I mean, you can quote yourself, that's perfectly okay. Of course, it then looks like you've been quoting yourself in the entire thing, and that's just not okay. So we need to differentiate between the reuse of a portion of your own work, which I would call recycling, text recycling, and duplicate publication, where you publish pretty much the same paper again. Now, there is the issue that has come up in the questions. What about my dissertation? Well, the publication should reflect that this was taken from the user's dissertation, the writer's dissertation, or if the dissertation is published later, it should make it clear, this is from my publication there. I just want to suggest transparency, making it completely clear that this is something that you've written before, and make it clear where it begins and where it ends, so that a reader who's actually read that can say, oh good, I can skip over that because I've already seen this before.
Thank you. There's another question from Micha Peche. As it was mentioned, translated plagiarism has even bigger difficulties in being detected. Would maybe a multinational initiative, perhaps in the EU, help to inspire progress in this respect?
Nope. That's the simple solution. I know it sounds hard because people are used to computers being able to do everything. And part of my job as a computer scientist is to make it clear to people, and especially to my students, that there are some things that are principally not doable. And these involve these kinds of questions that have to do with a combinatorial explosion. We're learning in the corona crisis what an exponential function is. And we have a lot of situations where we have multiple exponential functions that are just not computable. The number of potential different sources and the number of potential different languages is just so much that it's pretty much impossible to find the sources, except in specialized situations like Pika Pika, using just the Wikipedia and using the translation that is available, not from other translating tools, but from the Wikipedia articles, that is the Wikipedia article on this topic. Once we find a match, we can look at other articles in this way. Yes, Google and DeepL and so they've been doing great work on translation, but this is going the other way. This is going from one language to the other. What you're looking at is you have a text and you do not know if it's plagiarized or not. You do not know the source and you do not know the source language. You can have things that do work if there's a lot of nouns, for example, that are personal nouns, names of people, names of places and things that are not translatable. That is the only situation where up until now software has been able to find something. And I personally don't believe that translation software is going to get anywhere. But the companies are investing in it and they believe they're going to do it. So let them try, but I don't think that's going to be much of a help.
Thank you. Another question for you from Milan Ojsteršek. Quality of text matching software depends on database of documents it has. In case of students' works, it is important to have students work from their colleagues. Mm-hmm. Not all documents are available on the internet. You need to have access to institutional learning management systems. What's important is also the language. If text matching software doesn't have a language structure for documents, in some language, it is impossible to detect paraphrasing. Mm-hmm. So in research works, it's a problem with copyrights also. Almost all text matching software doesn't have agreements with publishers, so they don't have access to copyrighted work, books, research papers, and so on. So what is your opinion on these matters?
There's 3 issues that you're addressing here. One of them is students copying from each other. This is called collusion, where they're working together and they shouldn't. There are different software systems that work in the collusion area. And actually, there is some software that does a great job on this because you suddenly don't have the combinatorial explosion anymore. You just have a group of student papers that you want to check all with each other. So there are some systems that do this. I did a test 2012 of collusion detection software. So of course it's old, but it gives you some ideas of how good these systems are at actually detecting collusion. Not all of them are easy to use. But that is one area where we can actually make some progress. You've also said the problem of language, of course. Paraphrasing and language translation is, I think, pretty impossible to detect. We saw this that was one of the test cases that we prepared for our test-op test, and none of the software did anything with paraphrased translated plagiarism. The third question was with the copyrights. And now there's an interesting issue here. Yes, not all of the systems have access to copyrighted materials. Some of the larger systems do, in the meantime, have agreements with publishers that they can look into their databases and compare with their databases. Many researchers also publish a first version, a preprint, on a preprint server or on their own web page, or at places like ResearchGate, where the documents are actually available. And so it's possible to get us an idea, oh, this could be plagiarized from that source. And then you use your library's database connection in order to find the real source. And then you compare the two. So there's still a lot of work to be done there, but there is progress being made in this area.
Thank you. I have a question now for all 3 speakers from Vita Zahler. Could you say a few words about bringing together the preventive and curative measures of unethical research conduct? So, for example, the intertwined issue of plagiarism, data fabrication, and the publish or perish culture. So, what about prevention and also dealing, of course, with malpractice?
Can I jump in there?
Yes, sure.
Because my belief, after spending so many years working with plagiarism detection software that doesn't work, is our only hope is prevention. We have to educate people. Students have to be educated because many of them don't know that it's not okay. They're used to copying and pasting stuff from all over the place. And we have to make it clear why we don't. We give credit, and that's a really important issue. And next to the prevention, we also have to make it clear there have to be visible sanctions. And this is something that has surprised me. Of all these cases where we have informed universities about doctoral dissertations that are plagiarized to a high degree, And the universities don't want to rescind the doctorate. Oh my, that'll hurt that poor person. Well, I'm sorry. They hurt themselves by plagiarizing. And maybe they got a job on the basis of their doctoral degree that someone else who had done an honest work didn't get. So I think it's vital that the sanctioning be visible so that people can see, oh, I don't want to plagiarize because if I do, I'm in danger of losing my job, losing my funding, or failing a course. And that has to be communicated clearly.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I follow up? I agree wholeheartedly with Deborah about that. I mean, these are serious issues, and the difficulty really is what form the sanctions take, because the reason that she's had, Deborah's had the responses that she's had, and she knows why. The institutions want to protect themselves, and they're concerned about their corporate image. At least they're concerned about their corporate image, but, at worst, they're concerned about any legal issues that might follow. It might get expensive because somebody might say, well, prove it, or, I didn't do it, or, and it raises all sorts of issues of administrative complexity. I agree with that. We have, those institutions should find ways in which this kind of action can be sanctioned and penalized. I mean, the ultimate problem is when somebody is in post and they're in a, I've seen it in several cases where they're in an important post, and then their employing institution doesn't want to know about the fact that they plagiarized their PhD or some of their postdoctoral work, because that creates another problem for them, and an employment tribunal problem. That's happened fairly often. I might say that this is precisely one of the things that we're trying to address within the ProRes project that I mentioned before. Because our argument really has to be that there has to be a kind of culture embodied in a kind of normative framework, and that this begins with research training, right at the root of research training, so that, as Deborah says, people know what's right and wrong. Obviously not just about plagiarism, but and you have to get rid of this institutional culture of publish or perish. Publish what? Of what value? I had a supervisor who told me he'd only ever published one article because that's all he ever had to say. No, that was a long time ago, and people could survive in teaching posts, without, having published hosts and hosts of papers. So yeah, it's got to be endemic in the culture, and we have to find a way of doing it. ProRes is attempting to do that by building a normative framework. But obviously it's not the only project that's doing that. I think all of the RRI projects that Ildiko was mentioning before, those and the SWAPS projects are trying to do exactly the same thing, because we recognize it's awfully hard to find the right kinds of sanctions in this field.
Thank you. Ildiko unfortunately had to leave us because of other engagement, but I have here now an additional question for Deborah. Did any of the universities you informed about the plagiarism react positively and did something?
Yes, that's been the interesting thing that I've been investigating without ethics approval, just keeping track of what goes on. Some of the universities react very quickly. I have had a dean answer me within 30 minutes, shocked to the core, institute proceedings. All of our universities in Germany must have procedures in place. Not all of them know their procedures and follow them, but we've had quite a number of doctoral dissertations that have been rescinded. So there has been some progress there. What I find fascinating is that so many of the people who've had their doctorate rescinded take the university to court. And so we now have a large body of legal cases, even up to the Supreme Administrative Court in Germany, that have upheld the universities. As long as the universities follow their own procedures, which involves, setting up a committee and investigating and giving the person a chance to say something, as long as the university follows its own procedures, they're within their rights to withdraw a doctorate. So we have seen quite a number of these actually happen. It's been interesting to see on the political scene as well. Very few of our Ron Ipolyi cases have been political cases. Some of the political people have had their doctoral degrees withdrawn. Some of them haven't, with really flimsy discussions, like saying, oh, well, they plagiarized, but we're not rescinding the doctorate. And there's currently a case that's virulent here in Berlin right now with one of the ministers of Germany who's supposed to be our next mayor. It's just going on and on and on about the university not withdrawing her doctorate, although there were many cases, not just of plagiarism, but also of her just making up quotations and references that she didn't actually do. So we've had positive reactions to universities. We've had universities that react right away. I've had universities like the University of Rostock, I've had to call them a number of times to ask if they even got my email because they didn't bother to answer my email. And you're totally correct, Ron. It's the institutions thinking that they're protecting themselves by not talking about plagiarism. But in my opinion, they could protect themselves better and make it clear, we don't tolerate plagiarism here. We are a good institution and we don't tolerate that. So I think they could make a better image for themselves if they made it clear how much they support academic integrity.
Well, thank you, Deborah, Ron, Ildiko. It has been a great discussion. Unfortunately, we are now out of time. So I would like to thank you, the panelists, and everybody who has participated, listening and sharing their questions.